Welcome back, Hannah. It's always a pleasure to see you. We get so much information from you. For anybody who's never met you before, hasn't heard your previous podcast with us, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, of course. So, hi, Cass. Happy to be here again, too. So, my name is Hannah, and I'm a graduate from Western University in Ontario, Canada. And I have a background in biology. And for the past 3 years or so, I've also been involved in research, specifically antimicrobial resistance, which is a really interesting area. And so, I've been able to work in the lab, and then also I've been able to publish a few papers, too. And so, yeah, here I am involved in clinical trials right now, which is a really exciting area of research. And I love working with patients and then also, like I said, in the research area. So that's what I'm doing here at Heal Mary.
Well, and I think what's fantastic about what you do, Hannah, is you're taking complicated scientific concepts and really trying to make it easier for people to understand. I think there's a real knowledge gap, and I think making things accessible is really your strong point for us. What is happening in the world of clinical trials, specifically around, let's talk about blood cancer today and lymphomas. What's happening in that world right now?
Yeah, oh my gosh, there's so many exciting things happening in lymphomas and blood cancers. They're under this big umbrella term of hematological malignancies, which means cancers that are forming in blood tissue. And there's a lot of interesting things going on here. And then, of course, a lot of interesting things going on in the cancer world in general. But what I think people don't realize, and this is why you're bringing it up, I think, is that there are so many clinical trials that are happening all the time in all of these different areas of cancer. And so just to pull up some numbers, there's over 800 clinical trials that are currently recruiting patients that have lymphoma.
Wow.
And over 700 clinical trials that are currently recruiting patients that have leukemia. And this is just in the United States. And these are ones that are currently actively recruiting. And so, of course, there's other clinical trials that are just not quite in the process of recruiting yet, but just to show that there's hundreds.
Yeah.
And the thing too is because lymphoma and leukemia are both these types of blood cancers. A lot of times there's overlap between clinical trials where even though a clinical trial might be listed as lymphoma, if you're leukemia, you might be able to participate in that one too. And so really just to point out that this number is 700 and 800, but it might be even larger.
That's insane. And the reason why there's so many trials happening, especially in blood cancer, what's the reason for having so many options available?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think with cancer, and we're doing so well with this in research right now, but it's really important to have a lot of different ways to treat cancer. And there's multiple different types of therapies that are coming out in clinical trials, and we can kind of go through a few of the different ones. But like I said, it's important to have not just one type of treatment. Like, for example, there's chemotherapy, right? And everyone knows about chemotherapy being a really good way of treating patients with cancer.
Yeah.
But sometimes doctors will like to combine chemotherapy with a different type of treatment entirely. And therefore, if you're kind of coming at cancer from left, right, upwards, downwards, and all these different directions, one, you can make the treatment a lot more personalized for the patient. And then also it's just a lot more effective at treating the cancer when there's multiple ways that you're coming at it. And so we can talk through a few of the different types of treatments that are coming out. And there's a few really interesting ones in lymphoma, but also, of course, in the general cancer community. And so one of the first ones that's really interesting is called targeted therapies. And so targeted therapies are a really good way of treating lymphoma and leukemia because they tend to have really few side effects and symptoms that come with taking the medication. And what targeted therapies all work around is that there's certain proteins and genes that are involved in cancer that in normal people, they work normally, and they're really important to be involved with growing of cells and dying of cells, which is a process that happens all the time in our bodies. And yeah, so there are these genes that are involved in this. So certain ones will kind of tell cells when it's a good time to grow, and when a cell is damaged or old, there's processes that tell it to die. And this happens normally all the time. But in the case of cancer, these types of genes and proteins are really they're bad targets for cancer, because if those get messed up, then that's when there's way too much cell growth and way too little cell death, right? And so, yeah, feel free to ask any questions if you feel like I need to explain it in a slightly different way, but
yeah, well, let's dig into that, Hannah. Like, let's talk a little bit more about that, just because I want to make sure I understand. So are we saying that basically how cancer in this case works is your body is not shutting off that switch, telling your cells to not be duplicating? Is that what's happening, or how does it work?
yeah, so kind of. So yeah, there's all of these, there's a million different, okay, so I guess we'll go back and say that there's genes in our body, right? Because we all have DNA.
Yep.
And that DNA encodes these coding regions, which are genes, which are these little sections where each gene ends up creating a protein, and that protein in your body does all these different activities. And so normally, and over all the times, things happen properly and your body works perfectly all the time, and it's absolutely amazing. But sometimes when you have a cell and then it's making another cell, which happens all the time, right? You hear this thing that says every 7 years you have an entirely new body.
Yeah.
And the truth behind that is because cells are dying and they're growing, and they say every 7 years, all your cells that were there will now be new cells. So most of the time when a cell is becoming new cells, it happens perfectly and everything is exactly the same. But sometimes there's little mistakes that can happen where it's not copying over properly, and there's a little mistake in the DNA that can happen. And that happens like 99.99999% of the time it's correct, but that 0.10 to the negative 6 times there can be a mistake that happens. And your body has all these different ways of making sure that doesn't happen. But if it happens in these genes that are involved with regulating cell growth or cell death, then that can lead to cancer, because cancer is when there's too much cell growth and too much cell death. And so basically these targeted therapies are focused on those genes that are involved in these really important tasks like cell growth and cell death, because if those things go wrong, then it can kind of cascade into cancer, because cancer is too much cell growth happening.
Got it. And so these targeted therapies are actually specific to those genes. Is that how it works?
Yeah, exactly. So
Okay.
I'll talk about two genes that are really popular in lymphoma and leukemia. So the one is BTK, and BTK is a gene that's involved in promoting cell growth. So it's one of those ones that says, okay, like time to grow, time to grow, time to grow. And like I said, normally in most people and in all your cells in the body, it's working normally. But if you happen to get unlucky and you have that bad mutation in it, then it can be too much cell growth. So BTK is kind of acting too much. And so therefore, because it's acting too much, scientists can basically in the lab design something that inhibits BTK. So it kind of blocks it from being able to work too much. And there are actually lots of drugs that are already out in the market to treat lymphoma and leukemia. One of them is called ibrutinib, and the other one's called acalabrutinib. And these are both really popular targeted therapies that work on BTK to stop cancer cells from being able to grow so much. And then the other targeted therapy that's pretty popular in leukemia and lymphoma is called a BCL2 inhibitor. And BCL2 is another protein that's really important in normal cell death. And so BCL2, when acting normally, actually stops cell death from happening. And it's supposed to do that in normal ways. So normally a cell will only die if your body sends it signals that say, okay, this cell is damaged, it's time for it to die. And BCL2 is part of the regulatory network that helps to mediate that. But in some people with cancer, BCL2 will be acting too much. So it's stopping cell death too much. So even though your body might recognize that there's a cancer cell and it needs to die and something's wrong with it, because BCL2 is acting too much, the cancer cell isn't able to die, and then cancer will grow and grow and grow. And so again, there's a different type of targeted therapy that scientists have already created called venetoclax that they use in lymphoma and leukemia, and it's really effective. And all of these treatments are really great because they are so targeted at these proteins and genes that are wrong in cancer, and they don't have the same type of really bad symptoms that come with a chemical type of treatment like chemotherapy. So they're really good alternatives that are out there.
Do they exist right now in terms of as treatments? They already exist?
Yeah. So these three that I've mentioned, ibrutinib, acalabrutinib, and venetoclax, are already FDA approved, and they are being given to patients currently that have lymphoma and leukemias. And so, yeah, just to bring back this into clinical trials, the reason why these treatments are existing right now is because patients with these types of cancers actually participated in clinical trials previously to show that these are safe and that they actually do work effectively for treating cancer. But there are actually a ton, this is to bring it back to clinical trials again, there's a ton of different targeted therapy clinical trials going on currently, because the thing about cancer is that it's super resilient and it's always fighting back. And so you can give a patient venetoclax, for example, which is the BCL2 inhibitor, which stops cancer cells from being able to live so long, and they'll be able to do really well in it for a while. So maybe for a few years, it really effectively controls their cancer and they're doing well. But over time, cancer cells will kind of learn how to get around the actions of that drug, and they'll mutate and change. And so they'll be resistant to that type of medication. And so it's really important for researchers to come up with different types of targeted therapies that target other proteins involved, or target these same proteins, but in slightly different ways. So if the cancer has overcome it in this way, then you kind of can introduce another one that then it has to be able to overcome it in a different way again. So it's kind of like buying more time for patients and letting them switch into different targeted therapies. So, for example, there's like one clinical trial that's going on right now in the United States that's recruiting patients in Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee. And it's recruiting patients with lymphomas and then also CLLs. And it's looking at
a CLL.
CLL is chronic lymphocytic leukemia.
Okay.
And so it's like a lymphoma leukemia, both in a way.
Got it. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's technically a leukemia, but like I said, you can kind of see how now, like if you have a leukemia, you can sometimes participate in lymphoma clinical trials and vice versa, because they're both blood tissue cancers.
Got it. Okay.
But so this treatment is working at BCL2, and it's trying to inhibit BCL2. But instead of working like venetoclax, which inhibits BCL2 by kind of blocking it once it's already made, this new drug that they're looking at in this clinical trial actually stops BCL2 from even being made at all.
Wow.
So yeah, what's really useful about it is if a patient has been given the first line therapy, BCL2 inhibitor, and it's working really well, but then their cancer comes back, then hopefully you can give them a treatment like this, or enroll them in a clinical trial like this, which inhibits it in a different way. So your cancer won't have learned how to block that yet. And then therefore you might have some really good results in cancer, getting rid of your cancer again.
So if I'm understanding, this study in particular is looking at if your first line of treatment, as they call it, or your chemo or whatever, if at the end of it, it didn't work, or you happen to get cancer again, the same cancer, this is a solution? Is that what it's meant to address?
Yes, so they're trying to use it to address relapse cancers, specifically for patients who have relapsed on a previous targeted therapy, because they're using a different way of targeting that gene. And so if the cancers come past it already, then they're targeting it in a different way. But like you're saying, it is possible to potentially use this as a first line too. So what they tend to do in clinical trials is they'll end up trying to see if this new treatment is better than the treatments that they have out there. And so there's a lot of different ways that this drug could come into the market if it proves to be safe and effective. It could come out as a therapy that's given as a second line or third line treatment, or if it proves potentially to be better than a first line one, meaning that it does better at removing cancer or has less side effects, then it might actually be given as a first line one. But this clinical trial, the one I'm specifically talking about, is only in its first round. So it's a phase 1. And so depending on how it goes, it'll go into the different ones where they'll find out where it's best used in people's treatment regimens.
And when you say phase 1, really quickly, what are the different phases and what are they trying to do in each phase when you say this is a phase 1 trial?
Yeah, for sure. So there are typically 4 different phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 is typically the first clinical trial that's being done on patients. So before that, they're looking at this drug in human cells and sometimes in animals too. And this is the first one where it will go to patients. And so there's a lot of different regulations to make sure it's really safe when it's going to patients. Like they'll use a really low dose, and all of this has to be approved beforehand by different regulatory bodies. But phase 1 tends to be also a few number of participants who have, it usually tends to be a pretty severe disease. So patients who are mostly out of options for the most part. So that's phase 1. And then once clinical trials pass phase 1, meaning that they've been deemed to be safe and they find a good dose that's effective and isn't really giving any severe side effects, then they'll move on to phase 2, which typically just has a little bit more participants, and they'll be kind of focusing on the safety, but then also bringing in how is it actually affecting cancer and are we seeing tumor shrinkage? And so the beginning phases of clinical trials are more focused on safety. And then as it goes on later, it's more focused on how does it treat cancer and how does that compare to other types of therapies out there?
Awesome. And so someone interested in participating in a phase 1 trial, as you said, it's usually pretty severe at this point, and maybe their cancer has relapsed. So this is sort of ideal for somebody who wants to pursue an option that may not be quite yet to market, and it's actually innovative and new and upcoming. Would that be the approach, sort of?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I think, something that's important to remember is that, like I mentioned before, all the medications we have now that we use as first-line therapy because they're extremely effective at treating cancer were in clinical trials beforehand. And so in this way, clinical trials can be an opportunity to come across new drugs that are really effective, but just have to go through the steps of safety before they can be given to everybody. And so it is potentially an option that you could, be not doing well and you don't have any more options, but you participate in a trial and the medication does really well for you. Another thing to mention is that oftentimes if you participate in a trial and you're responding really well to treatment, there are ways that you'll be able to stay on the treatment too, even after the clinical trial has passed. And so I just want to emphasize that clinical trials are really about coming out with new medications that are trying to fight cancer well. And so they do care a lot about the patients and participants who are involved in the trial. And it's really a lot about safety too. And so there's tons of different regulations that are involved with it, tons of different checkups. And so there's a lot of information online about what a phase 1 trial entails and why it's safe and what to think about before you participate, that I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to go ahead and look at.
Well, and Hannah, I think it's really exciting because so you've brought up that, this is one set of therapies called targeted therapies. Are there other types of treatments or therapies that are through clinical trials right now?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. I know we spent a lot of time on targeted, but there's a ton more. There's chemotherapies that are coming out that are new. So we have lots of different types of chemical treatments that go through the body, which are chemotherapies to kill cancer cells, but they come out with new ones that are trying to mitigate side effects that are happening or can be more effective at treating certain types of cancer cells. And then one that I'll go into a little bit more in depth is immunotherapies. Immunotherapies are really exciting because it's basically harnessing your immune system, which is naturally a killer of all things foreign and bad in our body. So your immune system is really good at detecting anything that's foreign in your body, like bacteria or viruses, but then also cells that are damaged or like sick, like cancer cells. And so the way your immune system detects these things is basically by identifying proteins that are on the outside of cancer cells. So cancer cells will all have like proteins on the outside as well. Viruses, as we know with SARS-CoV-2, it has these proteins on the outside, and that's actually how we designed the vaccine. But anyway, going back to cancer cells, they'll have these proteins on the outside. And so your immune system will be able to bind to those proteins. And when it binds, it's basically like it's putting an X on that cell saying something's wrong with it, we need to kill it. It's kind of as if, a person who's a forester will go through a forest and will put an X on trees that are sick and needs to be felled. So it's like putting a target on it. But the thing about cancer cells is that they're super tricky and they're always trying to find new ways of evading the immune system. And so scientists kind of need to give the immune system a little boost and kind of help it out to find those cancer cells. And so in lymphoma, they're doing a lot of research to try and figure out and be able to actually sequence those proteins that are on the outside of lymphoma cancer cells. And so a lot of work has been done on B cells, which are a type of cell that is implicated in lymphoma. And they've actually characterized and been able to identify that protein on the outside. And it's called CD20 protein. And so scientists are able to engineer in the lab these things called monoclonal antibodies, which is basically like a fake version of the antibody that your immune system would produce to bind to those proteins.
So it's almost like it's creating all those X's to help mark on that cell which parts are the cancer cells, right? Like you were saying in the forest. So it's basically helping you create more X's on the cell. Is that how it works?
Yeah, it's kind of like training your immune system to be able to identify them well, so you can X them out and target them for cell death. So basically, once your immune system X's them, they'll destroy it, or it'll allow it to recognize it and do other things with it. And so that's a really cool way, because it's basically like we have this mechanism in our bodies too, and it's just your scientists giving it a little boost. And so there's already a drug that's out for lymphoma that's really popular. It's called rituximab. And this one has been really effective at treating cancer in people with lymphoma by targeting that protein on the outside of B cells. But of course, as we mentioned too, cancer is super resilient and it's always changing and trying to find ways to evade these things. And so as we talked about with targeted therapies, sometimes a patient will be on a medication like rituximab, which is this immunotherapy, and it works for a period of time, but eventually your cancer is able to overcome it and find ways to trick your immune system again. And so it's still really important to find different ways of targeting those proteins or different proteins to target. And so there is a clinical trial that I'll bring up right now too that is recruiting in the United States across 22 locations. So a lot of different states within the United States. And this one is slightly different from rituximab, which is the drug that's really popular and used right now, because not only does it target CD20 protein on B cells, but it also targets CD3, which is a site for T cells to bind. And T cells are kind of like natural killer cells in your immune system, and they'll be able to kill the cell. And so the idea is that even if someone actually has an issue where CD20 binding isn't working anymore, meaning that it was working before, but now the cancer cells are resistant to it, perhaps by putting them in this type of clinical trial where it's binding on 2 sites, it might be able to kill the cancer cell again.
Perfect. So if I understand, you've got the one, which is, already marking for a certain protein. And then this is a second line of defense marking an additional protein.
Exactly. So it's like kind of like 2 hits on the cell. So even if the one doesn't really work, you have the other one too.
Got it.
Yeah. And so that one's just really cool. That's just one example of the hundreds of immunotherapy clinical trials that are going on right now. And this one is recruiting patients with CLLs again, and also types of B cell lymphomas. And so that's a really exciting immunotherapy clinical trial that's coming out.
So the immunotherapy, is chemotherapy a branch of immunotherapy, the ones that you were talking about? It's not, it's completely separate.
Yeah, so chemotherapy is completely separate. Chemotherapy is a type of chemical that you're putting usually through an IV that circulates through your body. And chemotherapy works by killing fast growing cells. And so it works by killing cancer because cancer cells are super fast growing, but chemotherapy is kind of indiscriminate about what type of cells it kills as long as they're really fast. Yes. And that's why chemotherapy actually causes you to lose your hair, because it kills like hair follicles, which are growing really quickly.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then also too, how people with cancer who are undergoing chemotherapy will sometimes have sores in their mouth.
Yep.
That's because those cells are also turning over really quickly. And so they can get damaged by chemotherapy too.
Wow. And our current standard of care, I think the one that everyone's familiar with is chemotherapy. So the fact that, that is one that they're making developments in, but you've also shared with us targeted therapies as an option, immunotherapy as a potential option. Are there any others that it branches into for lymphomas?
Yes, there definitely are. And I'll just say quickly too, is that So depending on what type of cancer you have and how aggressive it is, how fast it's growing, because we have all these different types of therapies, your doctor can tailor and say, okay, I think the target will be best for you, or because your cancer is really aggressive, we'll start with chemotherapy. And so, I kind of talked about chemotherapy as if it's like a bad thing because it has these side effects, and it does have side effects, which are really difficult for patients, but it's still a really great way to treat cancer, especially ones that are already advanced and you really need to hit it hard.
Yeah.
And so having these different options is really about being able to combine them in different ways and tailor them in different ways. And so I guess that brings me into a different type of therapy, which is called combination therapy, which essentially is just as it sounds in its name, where you're combining perhaps a targeted and an immunotherapy together. And the idea here is that it's tailored to the person's cancer, whatever the doctors will think will work best for their type of cancer and the way it's presenting, like how aggressive it is or where it's located in the body. And the idea with combination therapies is that, like we talked about, if you're hitting cancer with this type and this type and this type, it's going to have a hard time responding. And typically your the effect it's having on the cancer will be really good. And so combination therapies, they do still need to be tested in clinical trials because they're trying out new combinations that have never been used before. So for example, combination therapies could be one treatment that is already FDA approved, like ibrutinib, for example, the BTK inhibitor. So it's already out there. Patients are already using it as a monotherapy, meaning that they're using it as the only therapy. But now they're combining it with a different type of therapy. And this one has also been FDA approved and it's also used by itself. But because these two have never been paired together before, scientists don't know if perhaps there's a weird interaction effect or they don't know what the side effects will be. So they'll still put patients through clinical trials to make sure that it's effective and that it's safe to be combining them together.
So let's say I'm super keen, because everything you're explaining to me sounds pretty amazing in terms of the amount of research going into one type of cancer. I can only imagine how it spreads across the board. How do I, as a patient or, a caregiver of a patient, start to look at these? How do I get in? How can I apply for the ones that are meaningful to me?
That's a good question. And I think it's an important question to ask too, because it's one thing to know that clinical trials are out there, but then it's another thing to actually be able to find them. And I think that's a challenge that Heal Mary is also trying to help as a company, because when you're reading about clinical trials, it is really confusing. Even in today, as I'm trying to break it down simply, I'm still throwing around all these confusing words like BTK and BCL2, right?
They all sound like boy bands when you say it like that. That's the first thing I thought. So now I've associated proteins with boy bands. We got this.
Yeah, I know, that's funny. But no, there's a bunch of different ways. So if you're at the hospital and you're working with a really good oncologist and a doctor, oftentimes hospitals will have clinical trials that are going on currently. And that makes it really convenient, because if you're already going to that hospital for treatment and then you're just going to a different area of the hospital for clinical trials, that's really great. And so sometimes your doctor will bring that up to you if they have ones that they think you might qualify for. But if they haven't brought it up to you yet and you're hearing this podcast, for example, and you're really interested, it's a really good idea to bring that up to your doctor and say, I'm interested in clinical trials. Are there any at this hospital, or are there any that you know of? And if you can't really go the hospital route and talking to your doctor about it, I mean, that's always a really good one to do first, talk to your doctor. But there's also a ton of different information online about clinical trials. If you just want to learn more, there's lots of information put out by cancer.gov, also clinicaltrials.gov, just to learn more about them. And then as for finding new clinical trials, there are a lot of different resources online. So clinicaltrials.gov it's basically a big conglomerate where they put together every single clinical trial that exists in the world, basically filters through clinicaltrials.gov. And you can put in different information about yourself. So what type of cancer you have and where you live. So if you're looking for ones in the United States or only in Georgia, for example, you can put that information down. And then it will give you a list of every single clinical trial that's out there at different hospitals. And then it gives information about what type of cancer you have to have, what type of treatment is being looked at, and then where it's located geographically. So that's a good one, just to see like what's out there and kind of this big shotgun approach. But then I would really recommend using Heal Mary too. I mean, I might be biased because I'm part of Heal Mary, but I think the reason why Heal Mary started and what we do so well is trying to really make it simple for patients to actually be able to see what's out there. We have a really good function that kind of translates complex medical terms into simple terms. So as you're reading through a clinical trial, when protein comes up, you can kind of highlight it and then a definition will come up. So if you're ever confused about what this means or what this clinical trial will require of you, we have definitions all throughout it that make it easy to understand. And also, the thing about clinical trials is that just because you're interested in, let's say, one of the ones that I've mentioned, doesn't mean necessarily that you can participate in it. So clinical trials have a really regimented eligibility criteria. And this eligibility criteria will entail things like your age, what type of cancer you have, meaning what cell is it in, how advanced your cancer is, whether it's stage 1 or stage 4, for example, and then even as detailed as what type of treatments you've undergone to treat your cancer previously. So all these eligibility criteria are really specific because clinical trials are really regulated and they want to be able to come out with very specific understandings after the trial. And so one thing that Heal Mary does well is it actually has filters to help you put down what stage of cancer you have and what treatments you have gone through. So it helps you click through these eligibility criteria a lot easier. And so, yeah, I would say that those are some good options to finding out more about trials.
I love that. And Hannah, I think you've written a blog post before, so I'll definitely incorporate the link into the bottom of this podcast on, how to prepare and what questions to ask their doctors or their practitioners, whoever they're working with, even how they talk to their, family or caregivers about it. So we'll definitely attach that in there. But if I'm hearing correctly, the process is definitely ask more questions, research into it, talk to your practitioner, talk to people, ask more questions about the studies, because I think you can even ask the study sites, more information. Is there any other piece of advice you give just in terms of the process or setting expectations?
I guess I have two ideas that are coming up. So the one, I think it's like you're saying, it's really important to ask questions. And we actually were able to meet with Blood Cancer Uncensored, which is a nonprofit kind of social organization. And so I feel like it's a really good idea for patients to even meet other patients that are going through the same type of cancer. And I think in those types of groups, a lot of really good information about clinical trials and other people's experience in them does circulate. So I feel like that's a good thing also, just to kind of have a patient network that you can bounce ideas off of. And then the other thing about managing expectations with clinical trials is I think it's a good thing to remember that when you're choosing a trial based on where you live, it may be a good idea to kind of broaden that search too, because you don't always necessarily have to travel for clinical trials. So depending on the treatment they're giving, if it's an oral one, you might be able to take that at home and just kind of do phone calls. And I think one of the things that COVID has really done well for all different areas is it's built this infrastructure to be able to take things over the phone, over Zoom, and get information virtually. And so there's always options to potentially take medications at home. And even sometimes clinical trials will fly you out to the different locations depending on what their budget is and how rare the cancer is. And so if you're interested, I would just encourage you to just have a look at a lot of different options, exactly ask a lot of questions. Feel free to contact study coordinators and ask, do I have to come, or how many times will I have to come for this clinical trial? Like, what can I expect? And definitely as you're going through this information, you're collecting trials that you might be interested in, bounce the ideas back off your doctor too, and they might be able to help you kind of understand more what's to be expected. And so I think as a patient dealing with cancer, of course, it's really difficult, but you have a lot of different resources there around you. And so definitely make use of the support systems and ask your doctor, ask the study coordinators, and just try to get as much information as possible.
Great advice. That is great advice. Thank you so much, Hannah. I know there's a ton of information here and you've provided it so clearly for all of us. I love how you break down things into analogies, so it's kind of easier for the rest of us to understand and grasp what these studies are trying to do. If people want to get more information, how do they go about getting more information and reaching out to you?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I hope that I explained everything well. And so, yes, if anyone has any questions or would like to learn more, or even interested in learning more and would like me to provide different resources, totally feel free to reach out to me at my email address. So my email is Hannah, so HANNAH @healmary.com. So I'm happy to receive emails there. And then another thing that I would say, that if people are interested in learning more about clinical trials, or perhaps if they're looking at one, but they're a little bit confused about the process, is totally feel free to reach out to us at Heal Mary. On our website, we have an area where you can ask us questions and get in contact with us. And you can also use our email at hello@healmary.com. And we actually have patient supporters within our team that will work with you one-on-one and get on a call with you, or just over email if you need help with anything on our website and finding clinical trials. So we're really happy to give you those resources there.
It's amazing, Hannah. And what I love, and thank you so much for saying that, because alongside of yourself, we have people on the team who have a wealth of knowledge, and our entire goal with all of this is just to make it easier for people to understand, and really approach the idea of new treatments to market, really understand what they're trying to do. And I really appreciate all the time you always spend with us, making sure that we understand exactly what's happening, and that the science that is being brought forward here is going to impact not just today, but potentially the standard of care 10 years from now. So thank you again. We so appreciate your time. I can't wait for the next one. I always learn so much. So thank you, Hannah. Thank you again.
Thank you.